Radical revolution, driven at least in part by ideology, is one of the characteristic features of the Cold War, and often conjures up images of Vietnamese communists in the jungle, right-wing Nicaraguan Contras, or even Mujahideen fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan. But while these fit popular images, what often gets forgotten about are some of the homegrown, domestic groups operating inside the United States. I'm your host David, and today we are going to be talking about one of these groups, in particular, the Weather Underground organization, often referred to as just the Weathermen. This is the Cold War. So, the 1960s and 70s were certainly defined by the global struggle between the superpowers. The United States positioned itself as a defender of democracy against the perceived threat of communism. However, inside its own borders, this narrative clashed with the reality of civil rights struggles, anti-Vietnam protests, and demands for social and economic justice, exposing deep fractures in American society. Domestically, and unsurprisingly, the Cold War influenced every aspect of political and social life. Dissent, whether it was direct against systemic racism, economic inequality, or foreign policy, was often dismissed as being subversive or anti-American, or even of being a communist plot. Not too different from the present, really. Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and leftist intellectuals were labeled as disloyal in an attempt to suppress challenges to the status quo. This environment of paranoia and repression formed the backdrop against which the Weather Underground organization, or WUO, emerged, redefining the boundaries of resistance during one of the most contentious periods in modern US history. In 1969, the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, once the largest and most influential student activist group in the United States, fractured under the weight of ideological divisions. As the Vietnam War escalated and the US deepened its global role as a Cold War superpower, debates within SDS intensified. Members grappled with the question of how best to confront US militarism and the systemic oppression it perpetuated at home and abroad. For the faction that would become the Weather Underground organization, the answer was clear. The time for peaceful protest had passed. They called for radical, militant action, breaking away from SDS to form an anti-imperialist movement committed to revolutionary change. For the Weather Underground, the Cold War was more than a geopolitical standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a system of global exploitation upheld by US capitalism. They viewed America's military interventions in Vietnam, Latin America, and beyond as the outward expression of an imperialist order designed to suppress national liberation movements and maintain economic dominance. The Weather Underground believed the United States used the Cold War as a justification for its exploitation of the global South, supporting authoritarian regimes and crushing uprisings under the guise of combating communism. At the core of the Weather Underground's ideology was revolutionary communism and anti-imperialism. They aligned themselves with global liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, drawing inspiration from anti-colonial leaders like Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh. These struggles were not isolated, but deeply interconnected. They saw the Vietnam War as part of a broader pattern of US aggression aimed at maintaining control over the world's resources and people. Their goal was not only to oppose US policies, but to dismantle the capitalist and imperialist structures driving them. The Weather Underground's commitment to global liberation extended to solidarity with domestic movements for racial justice. They recognized black liberation and anti-racist struggles within the United States as integral to dismantling the imperialist system. Drawing on the ideas of figures like Malcolm X and organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground saw their role as white allies working to disrupt the mechanisms of white supremacy from within. To them, the fight against systemic racism at home was inseparable from the global fight against Cold War oppression. The leaders and members of the Weather Underground played a critical role in shaping this radical vision. Bernardine Dohrn emerged as a defiant leader, often the public face of the organization. Fierce and strategic, she influenced the group's ideological direction and co-edited Sing a Battle Song, a collection of the WUO's writings. Bill Ayers, a former SDS organizer, brought intellectual rigor to the group, helping establish its anti-imperialist framework and contributing to the same publication. Other key figures also defined the WUO's trajectory. Diana Oughton, Ted Gold, and Terry Robbins, founding members who died in the 1970 Greenwich Village townhouse explosion, were deeply involved in the group's militant operations. The explosion, caused while assembling bombs for planned attacks, served as a turning point, forcing the organization to recalibrate its strategies. Kathy Wilkerson and Kathy Boudin survived the explosion and became lasting symbols of the group's resilience and its controversies. Wilkerson later documented her experiences in her memoir, Flying Close to the Sun, offering an insider's perspective on the group's underground existence. Boudin's later involvement in the 1981 Brinks robbery and subsequent imprisonment highlighted the enduring risks tied to the WO's legacy. Jeff Jones and Clayton Van Lidgraaf were pivotal in sustaining the organization through tactical expertise and ideological evolution. Jones, known for his ability to outmaneuver law enforcement, played a key role in keeping the WO operational. Van Lidgraaf pushed the group towards a Marxist-Leninist framework, cementing its alignment with global revolutionary movements. Through their break from SDS, the Weather Underground embraced a radical vision that rejected incremental reforms. They sought nothing less than the complete dismantling of US imperialism and the creation of a world free from exploitation, aligning themselves with revolutionary movements on a global scale. Their ideological foundation, shaped by these key members, defined their militant strategies and cemented their place in the history of Cold War resistance. The Weather Underground's primary objective was to oppose US imperialism, which they identified as the driving force behind the Cold War militarism and global oppression. The Vietnam War, as the most visible and violent expression of this imperialism, became a focal point of their efforts. By targeting the institutions supporting the war, the WO sought to disrupt US hegemony and challenge the structures of power that perpetuated inequality. Another critical goal was to confront the Cold War narrative that equated dissent with communism. In an era where anti-war and civil rights activists were frequently labeled as subversive, the WO reframed their actions as legitimate resistance to an unjust system. They positioned themselves not as the enemies of the American people, but as opponents of imperialism, framing their militancy as a necessary response to systemic violence. To achieve their goals, the Weather Underground employed a combination of militant tactics and ideological outreach. Their most infamous strategy was the use of bombings, which they described as, quote, armed propaganda. These symbolic attacks targeted government buildings, military facilities, and corporate headquarters, such as the US Capitol in 1971 and the Pentagon in 1972. The bombings were meticulously planned to avoid casualties, aiming instead to draw attention to US policies and demonstrate to a wider audience the possibility of resistance. The WO also adopted underground operations to sustain their efforts. Members lived in secrecy, often under false identities, in order to evade the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which sought to surveil and disrupt radical groups. Operating clandestinely allowed the Weather Underground to carry out their campaigns while avoiding the pervasive surveillance state that had intensified under Cold War anti-communism. In addition to militant tactics, the Weather Underground prioritized ideological outreach through publications like 1974's Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism. This manifesto articulated their critique of US capitalism, militarism, and systemic oppression, positioning the WO as a part of a global revolutionary movement. It served as both a statement of principles and an invitation for others to join their struggle. The Weather Underground's actions exemplified their critique of US imperialism and their commitment to radical resistance. Their first major public act, the Days of Rage in 1969, was a series of violent confrontations in Chicago intended to, quote, bring the war home by exposing the domestic consequences of US Cold War militarism. Though the Days of Rage failed to garner widespread support, it solidified the WO's shift towards militant action. Between 1970 and 1975, the Weather Underground carried out a series of bombings targeting symbols of US Cold War power, including the US Capitol, the Pentagon, and military installations. These actions, described as armed propaganda, aimed to disrupt Cold War institutions and force public scrutiny of their role in perpetuating global conflict. The publication of Prairie Fire in 1974 marked a pivotal moment for the Weather Underground. This 151-page manifesto contextualized US Cold War imperialism within global and domestic struggles for justice, emphasizing solidarity with anti-colonial movements and liberation efforts worldwide. It bridged the gap between underground militancy and broader leftist movements, demonstrating the WO's intellectual depth and revolutionary vision. The Weather Underground organization may have been founded on ideals of revolution and justice, but it was no stranger to contradictions and conflict, not only from external forces, but also within its own ranks. From internal sexism and ideological rifts to relentless government repression and public scrutiny, the WUO's story is one of navigating the messy realities of radical resistance during the Cold War. For an organization that sought to dismantle systems of oppression, the Weather Underground had glaring blind spots when it came to gender dynamics. Many women in the WUO, although instrumental to its operations, were relegated to traditional gender roles or secondary leadership positions. Despite their active involvement in organizing and direct action, they were often sidelined in favor of their male counterparts. Early on, women were rarely chosen as public speakers or prominent leaders, despite playing critical roles behind the scenes. Women within the organization also faced pressure to conform to a hyper-masculine culture that equated violence with commitment. This created a dynamic of coerced machismo, where proving one's revolutionary credentials often meant suppressing personal or collective expressions of feminism. While the WUO's sexual politics encouraged women to explore their desires and relationships, this often left them vulnerable to exploitation by male members, an unsettling contradiction for a group that claimed to stand against all forms of oppression. Attempts to address sexism within the WUO often fell on deaf ears. Feminist voices were marginalized, with many women feeling they had to downplay their politics to be taken seriously in the male-dominated movement. Some women left the organization entirely, opting to build the women's liberation movement instead. These departing members criticized the WUO's focus on violent action, seeing it as a manifestation of male chauvinism that failed to address the root cause of women's oppression. Although the WUO made efforts to incorporate feminist ideals, including creating a women's brigade and discussing women's liberation in Prairie Fire, these attempts were inconsistent at best. Women who pushed for a stronger feminist analysis were sometimes dismissed as divisive or even separatist. The internal dynamics of the WUO ultimately reflected the very patriarchal systems they sought to dismantle, a reality that undermined their revolutionary goals. Externally, the Weather Underground found itself squarely in the crosshairs of the US government. The Cold War paranoia of the era provided the perfect cover for the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which sought to discredit and dismantle radical groups labeled as threats to national security. The Weather Underground, branded as domestic terrorists, became a top target of this campaign. The FBI employed a variety of tactics, including wiretapping, infiltration, disinformation campaigns, and psychological warfare, not all of which were done within the bounds of the Constitution, as they sought to destabilize the organization. These efforts weren't just about catching members in the act. They were designed to foster mistrust, paranoia, and division within the group. Publicly, the government framed the WUO as reckless extremists, using the media to portray their actions as dangerous and illegitimate. This narrative effectively distanced the Weather Underground from broader movements for social and racial justice, limiting their ability to build coalitions. The constant surveillance and repression forced the WUO deeper underground, cutting them off from the communities they sought to mobilize. While the group's secrecy was essential for survival, it also contributed to their growing isolation, both from the public and from potential allies in the larger activist ecosystem. So, what happened to the Weather Underground? Well, the FBI happened, but not in the way you may think. In 1971, COINTELPRO became public knowledge, and the public outcry over the methods employed by the FBI forced COINTELPRO to be terminated. This included the dropping of charges against the WUO related to bombing and weapons. With these charges gone, members of the WUO found themselves in positions where turning themselves in was a much easier prospect. Some members remained underground, but the organization was starting to come apart, with racial divisions and even geographic divisions presenting themselves. By 1976, the WUO was defunct in all but name. Weathermen who remained underground either slowly gave themselves up over the following years, including as part of the amnesty for draft dodgers put forward by Jimmy Carter. Others found their way into other radical organizations and were then arrested for other crimes, including the involvement of several former members in a 1981 robbery of a Brinks Bank truck. So this leaves us to discuss their legacy. Of all the controversies surrounding the Weather Underground, none is more enduring than the debate over the use of militant tactics. The WO's bombings, self-described as armed propaganda, were intended as symbolic acts of resistance. Supporters argue that these actions succeeded in drawing attention to the injustices the WO sought to expose. For instance, the 1971 bombing of the US Capitol called out the invasion of Laos, while the 1972 Pentagon bombing highlighted the role of the military-industrial complex in perpetuating the Vietnam War. In this view, the WO's actions forced Americans to confront the violence of their government's policies, breaking through the complacency of the era. It would of course also be naive to think that it was the actions of the WO that ended US involvement in Southeast Asia, but the turn to violence is a reflection of groups who felt that normal methods of protest had failed. Critics of the Weathermen, however, contend that the bombings alienated potential supporters and reinforced stereotypes of radicals as dangerous extremists. They argued that the focus on violent symbolism detracted from the WO's broader message, making it easier for opponents to dismiss their cause. The debate over these tactics continues to shape the legacy of the Weather Underground, raising difficult questions about the ethics and effectiveness of violence in revolutionary movements. While their critique of imperialism, capitalism, and systemic oppression remains relevant, the Weather Underground's methods and legacy are deeply contested. They serve as a reminder of the high stakes and difficult choices that define revolutionary movements, but also the pitfalls of letting militancy overshadow broader goals of solidarity and justice. In the end, the Weather Underground leaves us with more questions than answers. How far should activists go in the fight against injustice? What are the limits of acceptable resistance? And can the means ever truly justify the ends? Their history offers both a cautionary tale and an opportunity to reflect on the complexities of resistance in times of profound political and social crisis. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. And remember, the Weathermen are very different from the Weather Girls. It's raining men. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.